Hello, Help the Hellbender followers. Welcome back to episode 2. This week we have the entire Help the Hellbender team on hand. Again, my name is Rod Williams with the Purdue Extension Help the Hellbender program. Nick?
Oh, I'm Nick Bergmeyer with the project coordinator for the Help the Hellbender program.
And I'm Shelby Royal, the Hellbender husbandry coordinator for Purdue.
So we will have our entire Help the Hellbender team on hand to answer questions that you might have for our guest here today, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute. I'll remind you that when you're asking your questions, drop those in the comment box below anytime throughout the program. We'll have Shelby behind the scenes answering those live, and then Nick will also be on hand to ask our questions to our guest speaker. And so our guest speaker today is Dr. Steven Spear, who is the Wildlife Ecology Director, the Director of Wildlife Ecology at the Wilds. Steve, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Rod. It's great to be here. As Rod said, I'm talking to you live from the Wilds, our Hellbender Conservation Center. And before I talk about Hellbenders, which I'm super excited to talk about, I want to talk just a little bit about the Wilds, give you a little intro and background, because it's a really neat place that I imagine many of you may not have heard of. In the Wilds is a really cool combination of a zoo, a conservation center, and a research station. And the reason for that is that we are on almost 10,000 acres of reclaimed coal mine land in eastern Ohio. So on the edge of Appalachia, about an hour and a half from Columbus, Ohio. And that allows us, from the zoo part, to have these really big pastures where we have herds of endangered deer, rhinos, giraffe. We have a carnivore center with cheetahs and species like that. And when you come visit, when we're open, you get to see those animals acting naturally and really, like our Hellbender program, contribute to conservation for those animals. So one real quick cool example, like we have scimitar horned oryx, which is an endangered species that went extinct in the wild in Africa. Animals that were born here at the Wilds were part of the reintroduction effort, and now that herd is back in its native range in Africa. And because we have the reclaimed mine land that we're trying to restore for native wildlife, a lot of my job is actually working with those sorts of species and helping with both habitat restoration and monitoring. And we do some, we reintroduce species like the American burying beetle, which is critically endangered. And then finally, we get to do a lot of research. So we have 2 lab spaces that I work in, and you're going to hear about how we use that today. So one last thing I'll say before talking about the Hellbenders is, obviously in the current situation, we're not open for tours, but hopefully we'll be soon. And one really important way that the work I'm going to talk to you about in the next few minutes is supported is through visitors coming to the Wilds. So if you're in Ohio or passing through and you want to have a really fun time, you also know that you're actually helping to support this Hellbender work. But let's start talking about the Hellbenders, because that's why you're here. And today we're going to talk about and show you our Hellbender larvae. So hopefully many of you tuned in last week and you heard a little bit about Hellbender head starting that Purdue was doing. And if you weren't, just a really quick recap. So head starting, we go and we collect eggs from wild rivers and streams, and then we bring the eggs back, hatch them here, and then raise those Hellbenders up for a few years until we can release them back. Last week, you heard about efforts in Indiana. We work with partners in mostly West Virginia, but also some in Ohio. And so most of the Hellbenders here, we've collected from the field in West Virginia and will release to vulnerable populations there. So Hellbenders only breed in a certain time of year, which is the early fall. So everybody, all the Hellbenders in here were hatched in late September, early October. So that means that our Hellbenders, our baby Hellbenders, just basically celebrated their 7th-month birthdays. So I'm going to turn around because our Hellbender setups, our baby Hellbender setups are behind me. So I'm going to also, let me switch so you actually get to see the Hellbenders and not me the entire time. Switch camera views. So this is an example of one of our larval Hellbender setups. And if your first thought is, I thought you said there were going to be Hellbenders, believe me, you will see them in a second. But this is actually what it looks like most of the time. And just to give you a real quick intro to how we're keeping them. So you see this orange pottery platter. As you might guess, all of our babies are underneath there. And I'll talk about why that is in a moment. And you can see this, this sponge filter over in the corner there. And that's how we keep the water clean. Now, normally this would all be bubbling and to get oxygen in the water, but it'd be hard to see the babies with the bubbles, so I've turned it off just temporarily. But so I'm gonna go overhead. Oh, you can see a little guy popping his head out there, but let me lift up this hide, and ta-da, we got baby Hellbenders. So hopefully last week you guys got to see some of the juvenile ones that were at Purdue. And if you did, you'll notice that obviously these guys are a lot smaller, but they're starting to look a little bit like a Hellbender would. You can see that wide flattened head. Their tail is starting to look a little bit more rudder-like. And it's probably a little tough for everyone to see, but if you see like a little patch behind their head, I can see it a little bit looking through the camera. It almost looks, yeah, just like a little bump from the back of their head. Those are actually gills. And that's how the baby Hellbenders get the oxygen from the water. They have these external gills, but they actually don't keep them forever. And in fact, in a year or two, they start to lose them. And adult Hellbenders don't have those external gills. And in fact, the adults are breathing through skin. So let's see, trying to get a lateral view here. Trying to get it so it's in focus. The babies aren't super cooperating with me. But yeah, so let's see. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can start to see folds along their skin. And as they get older, they'll develop those more. But the way they're sitting, they're not really cooperating with me to get a good lateral view. So I talked a little bit about what they look like, but as I pulled up that hide, and that's where they all came out of. And the reason for that is that these little babies need to hide most of the time. And you can probably take a guess as to why that is. These little Hellbenders, if they're out in the open, they're basically Scooby snacks for all the aquatic predators that are around. And so they need to protect themselves by going into underground in small spaces. And they're born underneath a large rock. That's where their eggs hatch out. But in the spring, when they start to move around, they actually go into the very bottom of the river. So the little tiny rocks that you'll see on the bottom of the river called cobble, they go in those little cracks. And you can kind of see, I mean, they're even pushing against the side of the tank. They do not want to be exposed except for that one guy there, but they do not want to be exposed even in these tanks. And so they go down in those little cracks, and that's how they protect themselves, because the big predators can't get there. Fish, a big crayfish can't get down there. And also they have to eat something too, right? So they're eating little small insects that also live down in that cobble. So it's the best of both worlds, right? They get food and they get shelter and they're safe. And that's one of the reasons why, because of that reliance, is one of the reasons why Hellbenders are declining, because when there's erosion and sedimentation, which is the biggest threat to Hellbenders in general, and especially these little guys, it fills in those tiny little spaces first. And so they literally lose their home. They don't have a place to go. They have to go on the surface, and they just can't survive. So that's why these guys are really precious. That's why we do the head starting and bring them here, because they're going to survive here and do well until they get bigger, when they can hold their own. But there's also something else really neat that we're doing here. And I will kind of swing around a little bit and show you one of our experimental tanks. So if you guys can see, we have these tanks with these two partitions in there. And then I'll kind of go overhead, a little bit of a glare there, but you can see there's a little hide in each of these partitions, as well as the sponge filter. And this is part of an experiment that we are doing in collaboration with field researchers. So I think I'll go ahead and sit down, and I'm talking about this particular experiment. So you guys can see, let me switch my camera real quick so you can see me real quick. So what we're doing, why we have those Hellbenders like that, is of course because we're worried about where there are successfully surviving larvae in the wild. Some of the Hellbender field researchers are looking for them too, because if we can find the larvae, we know that it's a good population, and we want to know how many babies are successfully being born and surviving. So we've started a project with collaborators in North Carolina and South Carolina, so that are doing this sort of work in the field. So that includes Shem Unger at Wingate University, Kathowski and Lauren Diaz at Clemson University, and Lori Williams at North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And what they're doing is a really cool project where they're trying to be able to figure out a way that they can reliably count the baby hellbenders that they find. And they're able to find some down there. If you guys remember last week, Nick talked about for the larger hellbenders, they do something called pit tagging or microchipping. So then you can put a reader over it and it tells you a unique code. And so you know if you've caught that individual again. Well, you saw those little guys, they're way too small to put any sort of microchip in. So we have to be more creative. And one way that you can do that is actually injecting little tiny pieces of fluorescent plastic. So I can show you this right here. This is kind of a card showing some of the examples. Little tiny pieces of fluorescent plastic underneath their skin. And it doesn't hurt them at all. And it allows us, if you do different color codes, it allows researchers to know if you've seen that same hellbender. So even though you can see the colors really well right now, when they go underneath the skin, they get obscured. They're hard to see because hellbenders have dark skin. And so we use this, it's basically a flashlight that's a dark light that we can shine on and it will fluoresce. And I'll actually give it a try to see if you can see it, what it looks like through the camera. It doesn't always show very well, but let's try. So you guys see how that shines when I'm showing it on there? Each of the ones kind of fluoresce and glow. So that's what we're doing. We're putting that light on there. Sorry, I'm moving the video back. And just to show you an example of what it actually looks like. Now, if I tried to shine this light on one of our experimental larvae, it would be really hard for you to see in the camera. It really needs to be kind of dark. But I did take a photo of one of these larvae with how they're marked. And so hopefully you can see this well. This is a picture taken from undersides. The way they mark it is to put it on the bottom of their feet, basically. And so you can see this hellbender has 3 pink marks on its feet and then one green mark. And so each one of these has a different unique pattern of colors. And why we're doing this is to see, okay, number one, does it work right away, which we kind of figured it would, but do these tags stick around? So we could mark the hellbenders right now, and then maybe their skin gets too dark, or the little pieces of plastic pop out in a month, and you've caught the same individual and you don't know it because they've lost the tag. So because we're gonna have our babies until they're juveniles and big enough for pit tags, we'll go through the entire timeline at which you'd wanna know if those marks hold. And so we're actually checking and taking pictures like that each month to see if it holds. And if it does, then our collaborators in North Carolina know that that's a reliable way to do their hellbender research. And so it gives these larvae a chance to do double duty. Not only are they helping the populations in West Virginia when they get older and we release them back there, but they're also helping their cousins across the entire range by giving us information that would be super hard to get otherwise. So I enjoyed telling you a little bit about our larval hellbenders. I hope you have and will continue to have lots of questions. And for now, I'll kick it back to Rod.
Hey, Steve. So,
Or
so
Nick, I'm sorry, Nick.
yeah, we do have a handful of questions. And just a reminder to everybody, if you have more questions, just keep throwing those in the comments, please. So our first question is from Patricia Dickerson, and she asks, how are the hellbenders beneficial to the ecosystem? Yeah,
so hellbenders, I think, have a couple of reasons why they're important in the ecosystem. One is they are a pretty good indicator of water quality, especially really good water quality, because the streams where we're losing hellbenders, where they're dropping out, that's because there's either pollution or sedimentation or anything else or things like that that are really hurting the water quality, which of course hurts us eventually because we're drinking it. And it's not a good sign for our health if we start to see that. But as far as what the hellbenders do in the rivers, they can be really important predators of a lot of smaller species. Like for instance, the thing they eat the most is crayfish. And while it's really hard to study this and there's not a lot of good direct research, it's easy to imagine that in some of these rivers where hellbenders were formerly really common, and we know in places they used to be really common, that there's no longer those predators there. And so things like crayfish are probably gonna get a lot more abundant. And we know crayfish, for instance, can have really strong like downstream effects. So we expect that hellbenders are probably have some importance in that regard, although we don't have the direct research because it's something that's really hard to study.
Okay. So our next question is from Amanda Newsom Penn, and she would like to know, do the colors mean anything for the VIEs, or are they just to have a different color per individual?
Yeah, no, the colors are just a mark to be able to tell apart. So now researchers, can make a certain population match a certain color, but as far as how it works, no, they're just different fluorescent colors. Otherwise, the mark's exactly the same. Okay. Hi, Amanda.
So another question is, how often do you guys find babies in the wild?
Unfortunately, it's become quite a rare occurrence, particularly in the areas where I do most of my fieldwork now, in West Virginia, same sort of Ohio. There's actually very few rivers where one can reliably find larvae, and where hellbenders seem to be commonly reproducing, which again is one reason for our Head Start efforts. We'll find eggs, but not so much larvae. So if you do find larvae, it's a sign. It's a pretty good sign that hellbender population is doing much better than most. So where I am now, it's very, very rare. I can probably count on my hands the young and larval hellbenders I've seen up here. In some of the places like down in North Carolina, there's a few populations that are in the mountains in the national forest where they're doing better, and they're still hard to find, but the researchers do find larvae a bit more often.
Okay, yeah, and we haven't found larvae in Indiana for a very long time. So here's a question that we always expect to get. Carrie Kublank would like to know, why are they called hellbenders?
Hi, Carrie. So we don't know 100% for sure, but the best guess is because they live underneath rocks, and the big ones live underneath big rocks in the streams. And it's people who are fishing or walking along the rivers and would see this, big, monstrous looking salamander come out from under these rocks. I mean, it basically looks like they're coming out from under the underworld, right? And I think they look awesome and cute, but a lot of people think they're kind of ugly and monstery. So that's probably where it probably a scary thing coming from underneath the rock, coming out of hell.
Oh yeah, that's always a great answer. So we've got another one from Laura Brandy. Oh, sorry, Laura Branby. And when you release hellbenders, do they congregate under the rocks like they do in captivity?
So when we release them, the size that they're at when we release them, which is much bigger, like almost sometimes almost a foot long, we give them, for the most part, we usually give them their own rock. Every once in a while, especially if they're smaller, we'll put a couple underneath a rock when we're releasing. Last week, Nick talked about like the cobble beds that they do in Indiana. The way that we've done it thus far in West Virginia is we go out and search for suitable rocks and release them there. And the reason we do that is the size at which we're releasing them. They're great together at this stage. They're not going to bother each other, but they do start to get territorial when they get larger, and they might fight with each other. So we don't put them together at that point.
Okay. And let's see. So here's an interesting question. So Julia Geschke asks, are you involved in any advocacy work to address the factors leading to decline?
That's a really good question. Yeah, because I mean, the head starting buys us time, but if the habitat doesn't improve, then we don't want to be doing this forever and ever. And yeah, I mean, we are working with partners across the region that are focusing on trying to improve habitat. One thing that's really great, especially in Eastern Ohio, where there are still some of the Hellbender populations. There's a lot of watershed groups, there's different land trusts, things like that. And they're the ones that are kind of the front line talking to the private landowners, getting erosion controls, cows out of streams, putting in artificial nest shelters for Hellbenders. They a lot of times can be our liaison. I mean, obviously we're talking to landowners when we come across too. But you're absolutely right that part of any Hellbender conservation program is lacking if it's not tying into partners that are also working to improve habitat. But because that takes a while, and because of multiple private landowners along a river, if we just waited to improve the habitat, the Hellbenders might be gone by that point, which is why the head starting is such an important component as well.
All right, Steve. So that is all the questions for now. So if you want to keep going.
Yeah, so I want to talk to you guys about one other thing. And that's, I mentioned research, and obviously we have the VIE research with our partners that we're doing with the larva. But another bit of research that I do in Ohio, West Virginia, I've also done it in a number of other states, is we need to know where Hellbenders still are, right? Because we know they've declined quite a bit, but there's a lot of rivers where historically we expect Hellbenders should have been there, but we just don't know if they are there right now. And you can't just walk along the edge of a stream and necessarily see a Hellbender. So I do some research along with other collaborators where we look for Hellbenders using this, a bottle of water. So this is a bottle of river water, and I can detect a Hellbender from this. So again, you may be thinking I'm not making sense. You certainly don't see any Hellbender. They're not going to fit in here. This is just some clear water. But the reason I can do that, or anyone working with, is using a technique that's called environmental DNA. And maybe that sounds like a fancy term, but when you break it down, the idea of it is actually surprisingly straightforward. So this may just look like a bottle of clear water, but what it really is, it's a soup of cells that are shed by whatever is living in there. So anything, any fish, salamander, crayfish, whatever have you that's in that river is going to be shedding skin cells, urine, that sort of thing. If they fight, there's cells that go into the water there, and it really makes this bottle a soup of cells. Well, I know there's a bunch of cells in here, and I know that cells contain DNA, and DNA is the blueprint for species, right? We can tell different species from their DNA. So I can take that bottle of water and a really simple setup. So this is just a flask. I have a filter in this cup, and then this electric pump, and I can pour water in here and then run all the water through the filter that would be in this cup. And when I do that, I can take the filter out and bring it into the lab, because that filter is catching any cells that pass through. So the water goes through, but the filter is fine enough that it will catch all the cells that are passing through, or at least a lot of the cells. So then I can take that filter disc to my lab, my genetics lab, which we have on site here at the Wilds, and I can extract the DNA from those cells. So just get a tube that's just got DNA in it, and then I can take advantage of the fact that each species has DNA that's in a little bit different sequence at different places. And so I can find a sequence that only matches, in this case, Hellbender, only matches the Hellbender DNA sequence at that one spot. And I can use that to make millions of copies of the DNA that I got from my filter, but that it's only making the copies that belong to Hellbenders. And so then I can use a genetic analyzer that is going to allow me to see how much, or to see if there is any of that Hellbender DNA there. If there's nothing, there's no copies that are going to be made, and it's just going to be a flat line. If there is, I'm going to see an increase, because I'm also using a technique where I put a little, well, I didn't, but we have a little fluorescent dye that's along with that genetic marker, and that fluorescent dye only shines when it's making copies. So I see that fluorescence if there's Hellbender. And so I see that increase and I know there's Hellbender in there. And so we have used that technique in lots of rivers now, us and collaborators, Purdue included, as well as others. And what we found is that it's a really good method to find if Hellbender's there. It's really sensitive. We only need to get a very small amount of DNA to be able to detect that it's Hellbender. And so that's really great for finding out where they still are. And of course, our next step, though, is trying to see if it can tell us about how many there are. You know, I talked about trying to count larvae. You know, knowing whether there's one Hellbender or many is the next important step. And so there's ways you can estimate the amounts of the DNA. And then there's other more experimental approaches that we're trying right now that we're using to try and help estimate how much is in there. And that's definitely an active line of research for us. But it's a really neat way for us to be able to rapidly, without having to lift rocks, without having to touch a Hellbender, be able to learn a lot more about their populations. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that or how we use DNA to understand Hellbenders for any of you guys that have them.
All right, Steve, do you guys have a good idea for how far away you can detect an animal from where it's actually sitting in the river?
That's a really good question. Obviously, river, the water moves. So the water we're sampling may have been, upstream before when we got it, depending on how fast the water's going. We've done a little bit of work with Hellbenders. Other folks have done work with other species. And while we're still trying to figure out a real precise kind of average distance, what we've done thus far kind of suggests that it's usually not more than a few hundred meters at most, and probably most of the time less than that. What we're seeing most often is that, if in the experiments we've done, if the Hellbender's just, a few feet or in front of where we're sampling, that, we'll pretty much always get it there. But if it's, say, further up, like, 100 meters or 200 meters, we can still sometimes pick it up, but it's not really consistent. So if we do it multiple times, sometimes we'll get it and sometimes not. So it probably means that every once in a while you'll have some cells that make it that far, but most of the time that's not happening. But what we're pretty certain is that you're not picking up Hellbenders that are miles away. But within, that few hundred meters, that's probably the window.
Okay. Do you know how long that the eDNA lasts in the water?
It actually doesn't last very long at all. So cells, and then when DNA gets released, the DNA gets degraded really quickly by a lot of things, the UV light from the sun, bacteria and other things in the river. So there have been experiments that have looked at how long eDNA lasts in water once you remove the animal. And most of it goes away within a day or two. And in most cases, after a week or so, it's completely undetectable. So in the river water, it doesn't last very long if the animal's not there anymore.
Okay, so are there certain times of year where it's a better idea to look for it than others?
We try and focus, we tend to try and focus toward typically toward the end of summer. There's a couple of reasons for that, or the beginning of fall. One is those tend to be lower water levels, and the less water, the less dilute it's going to be. So if you have really high water levels, you might get fewer cells just because it's all diluting out. And also you're more likely to get a lot more sediment, and that really clogs those filters up and makes it hard to sample. The other reason why the end of summer or beginning of fall can be a really good time for Hellbenders is we know, because that's their breeding season, we've done some research and shown that you get a lot more DNA being produced during the breeding season by Hellbenders than you do during other time of year. So it creates a time where they're just more likely to be Hellbender DNA in the water.
Okay. All right. And we have another question from Amanda Newsom-Penn. She would like to know, at what age do you release your Hellbenders from the wild?
So we release them typically between 3 and 5 years old, depending on a couple of things, depending on the size they are. Sometimes different cohorts grow at a slightly different size. And it also depends on when we can get into the water. Last year, we released 144 Hellbenders. And the reason why it was that many is that we weren't able to release any the year before. So we had some that we would have preferred to release the year before. And that's because the two years ago was an extremely wet year. And that might seem kind of funny that more water would be a problem for Hellbenders, but the rivers got so high and actually really, really silty that we just couldn't find the right rocks to release them. And we have to put them underneath rocks. If we just put the Hellbenders into the river, they'd probably be eaten by a raccoon, within the next hour or two of that. So it depends on factors like that. But the youngest is 3 years and the oldest is 5 typically.
Okay. Yeah, and we tend to see that when you wait a little bit longer, they have a little bit better survival, and if you release them in that high water, they just get washed right downstream.
Yeah.
So Patricia Dickerson, she asked, is a Hellbender's color due to what they eat? She has been personally asked to paint different colored Hellbenders, and she was just wondering what causes their color.
That's a really good question. I don't think it has to do with what they eat, but I honestly, you see a lot of variation in, they tend to be, brownish darkish, but like in blotching and all sorts of things like that, there's a lot. Some Hellbenders have almost like close to orange bellies in some places. So there's a lot of variation, and it's hard to say what's behind that. Honestly, Nick, I'd be interested if you have an answer to this. I imagine some of it's genetic, but how much the environment plays in their color? That's a really good question that I don't know. I don't know. Do you know at all?
I certainly don't know. I guess I would speculate that most of the Hellbenders that come in different colors, I've noticed, have been from different regions of the country. I feel like in some areas they tend to be grayer with different colored splotches, and I just kind of assume that has to do with the type of geology where they live, and the rocks that make up the bottom of the stream, and the camouflage that they've evolved for that area. But who knows? We do know with other amphibians that when they are young, there is evidence for matching the substrate. So what you said, Nick, that they might match the colors on the bottom a little bit, could be a possibility. Although they're under cover most of the time, so you wouldn't think that would be quite as important, but still, Hellbenders match up really well on the bottom of the river when they are out from underneath the rock. All right. And so I think I have one last question. You mentioned earlier that you use the eDNA so you don't have to lift rocks anymore. Why would you not want to lift rocks?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One, just from a researcher standpoint and efficiency and trying to survey as many streams as possible, it's a lot of work. That alone is not a reason not to do it, but it slows you down as to what you can cover. But there's also concern about how the rock lifting might affect the Hellbenders themselves, because a really good Hellbender rock is actually kind of in the bottom, almost slightly embedded on a lot of their sides, with a relatively narrow entrance that they can go in. If there's lots of space underneath the rocks, then predatory fish and things like that can get in. And no matter how careful you are when you lift a rock and put it down, you've kind of broken that seal and that embeddedness, and it's not going to fit quite as well for that Hellbender when you put it down. So if we can at least reduce the amount of that sort of disturbance, then it's probably going to be better for them. Obviously, there's some things that you might need to lift rocks for. If you need to know, the exact information about those animals, or need to have them in hand, which for some things we do, then you still need to do that. But if we can reduce it, that's really great, especially if we're just trying to do an initial filter to see, are there any Hellbenders in the stream at all, before doing more focused research.
Okay. And well, I guess we have one last question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. So Laura Branby asks, have there been predator studies on things that eat Hellbenders, adult Hellbenders specifically?
There's been a little bit. There's been some studies in the lab. So there's been studies looking at the effect of fish. Certainly with the work that you guys have done at Purdue with the younger ones, looking at conditioning for predators from fish. as far as the adults, I mean, we know just from observations that raccoons, otters, probably mink will eat them. I'm trying to think, I don't think I'm aware or can't think of a field study where they've really quantified like the amount of predation. It would be definitely a really difficult thing to study. But we know from many observations and from the radio tracking of ones that are released that aren't technically adults, but are getting toward that size, that things like raccoons are huge predators. But for an adult population that's not been released or head started, I don't think we have exact numbers for that, unless I'm blanking on a study.
I'm not aware of any. I mean, we did have a radio tracked adult that got attacked by. We saw it getting attacked by a mink, and that's really the only one that we're aware of. But that's it for all the questions, Steve. So I'm going to turn it back over to you and Rod, and thanks for coming today.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed this, and thanks everyone for listening and learning about our Hellbenders.
So thanks again, Steve, for joining us. And I know everybody certainly appreciates all the wonderful Hellbender conservation that you and the Wilds are doing with Hellbenders, and of course the really cool research that you're doing with eDNA and how that's really transformed the way that we are able to sample Hellbenders much more broadly than we've ever been able to do before. So again, congratulations on all the great conservation work, and keep up all this wonderful work in the future.
Yeah, and thanks for hosting this series. I enjoyed the one last week, and I'm looking forward to next week as well, which I'm sure you're about to plug.
Absolutely. Thank you for that segue. All right, as we let Steve sign off, just wanted to share with you guys that we do have another episode coming up next week, next Thursday at 3 p.m. We're going to be working with some of our additional partners. So we've partnered with the Wilds in the past, and we're going to be introducing some folks from the Mesker Park Zoo and Botanical Gardens in Evansville, Indiana. And the focus of their work, their Hellbender conservation, is very different than what we've heard about before. And they're going to be walking us through a breeding raceway. They actually have adult Hellbenders in captivity, and they've been trying to get those to breed. And you're going to hear all about that. You're going to get to see their setup. And then they've also have some subadults that they're rearing in captivity. And we're going to hopefully do a feeding session so that you get to see those Hellbenders get to feed on some of the prey items that the zoo's feeding their particular individuals. So tune in next week when we join Mesker Park Zoo and Botanical Gardens in Evansville, Indiana, Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you then.